In this video, we'll take a closer look at Razor View and how to use it to generate HTML pages. Razor is the name of the view engine used in ASP.NET Core. It plays the same role as JSP in Java Web MVC applications, like the ones we did in CS3220. As we'll see later, it's similar to JSP in many ways. We already saw how Razor worked in previous examples. Basically, after an action method returns a view, the framework locates a view file, combines it with the layout page, and converts it to a C# class. You can actually find the C# classes converted from the views in this folder. The first step is known as view resolution. It maps a view name to a view file on disk. Without any additional configuration, view resolution works like this. Given a view name, the framework will first look for a view file called name.cshtml under a folder matches the controller name under the views folder. If the file is not found there, it will look for the file under the shared folder under the views folder. If the file is not there either, it will look for the file under the shared folder under the pages folder. Of course, if the file is still not found, there will be a 404 error. These are the view helper methods in the controller class. We usually use the first two, one with a model object and one without. For this two, the view name is considered to be the same as the action method name. It's also possible to use a view name that's different from the action method name. We just need to use these two helper methods and specify the view name as the first argument of the method. Once the view file is found, it's combined with a layout page. But that's actually not all. In addition to the layout page, two other files are also part of the combined page. We'll look into those after we learn the Razor syntax. But before we get to the syntax, it's important to understand what a view engine is supposed to do. And this will help you understand why the syntax is designed the way it is. Remember that a view is not supposed to have lots of logic in it because logic is supposed to be in the controllers. So when it comes to logic in a view, or in other words, the dynamic elements in a view, it's really just two things: access objects and their properties, and some basic control flow structure like if-else and for loops. This, for example, is a view in JSP. Notice that JSP uses so-called expression language to access objects and properties, and uses JSTL tags for some flow control, like the cif tag and the C for each tag. If we do the same using Razor View, we can see that the structure of the page is very similar. Expression is simply at followed by a C# expression, and the control flow is basically C# control flow statements plus a at symbol in front. Razor syntax is actually pretty simple. A Razor view consists of HTML text and the C# code. You really just need to remember two rules. If you see a at symbol, it means the view has transitioned from HTML to C#. And if you see a HTML tag or reach the end of a C# code block, it transitions back to HTML. Take this one for example. It starts with HTML, and when we see an at symbol, it means it transitioned to C#. And once the C# part ends, it transitions back to HTML until it gets to another at, it becomes C#. And when we encounter a HTML tag, it becomes HTML until it reaches another at. It means it's transitioned back to C#, and HTML tag means this part is HTML, and end of C#, HTML, end of C#. So all in all, a result view is really just HTML and C# going back and forth. With that being said, there are a few additional rules. First, there is something called directives, which are basically at plus a keyword. Here are some common directives. The one we use most often is at model, which declares the type of the view model object. Like in C#, we can use using to import a namespace, but in a result view, we need to say at using. And inject lets us to do dependency injection in a view. Remember, a result view is really a C# class, so dependency injection works for view as well. Section allows us to have additional blocks in a layout page. We'll see an example later. And then there are a few directives related to the so-called tag helpers. We'll talk about tag helpers in the next video. Besides directives, there are three ways to write C# code in a result view: code blocks, expressions, and control flow structures. A code block starts with an at, then a pair of braces, and inside the braces we can write basically any C# code. In addition to C# code, we can also write HTML directly like this. Again, the rule is basically if you see a HTML tag, it's HTML. An expression is basically a C# expression, again prefixed with an at symbol. In most cases, we can just write an expression, and the result view engine will try its best to figure out where the expression ends. For example, here it will figure out that this expression ends at ID instead of ID less than slash, something like that. However, sometimes the result engine does need some help. For example, here it's not quite clear whether the expression should end at now, followed by some text, or it should end at 7 days. In this case, it's better to put the expression inside parentheses, so the view engine knows the whole thing is an expression. And then, just like in C#, we can use control flow structures like if else, for each, and so on. The syntax is basically at followed by C#, then the pair of braces basically forms a code block, and we can then write both C# and HTML inside the code block. This is what if else looks like. Note that else if and else do not need the actual at symbol at the beginning. And this is how we can do switch. Not much more to say. And This is a for each loop. Again, inside the code block, we can do regular C#, HTML, and also reader expression. And this is a for loop example. Same thing here, regular C#, HTML. Inside the HTML, we can also do expression. And the same thing using a while loop. And notice that we can use a code block to define a variable and then later use that variable in another control flow structure or code block. Basically, writing a reader view is just like writing C# code, except that instead of using a method call to print out HTML text, we just write HTML text directly. Reader view syntax is actually quite simple, so we won't do many examples. You can try some of this yourself. And here we just do a quick example. And let's go here. This is a page, and where is that page? Let's find it. Okay, so this is a syntax page, and if let's say not syntax page, index page. Let's say do some reader example. Okay, and so let's say we'll generate a random number, integer, and then we'll use a if statement to check whether the number is an even number or odd number, and then we generate some HTML text accordingly. So to get the number, we'll first use a block. We'll say the number is, we'll create a new random object, and then we'll say next. Next, we'll return a integer, and okay, we'll do next and min value, max value. So we'll say next max value. Okay, so let's try a random integer from 0 to 100, and then we'll do a if statement. We'll say if number modulus 2 is 0, that means it's even. So we'll say number is even. Notice that here we are using an expression, and this will give us the value of that. And then we can say else. And in here we'll say number is odd, something like that. Control KD to format, and it says 68 is even, refresh, 26 is even. So as I said, the syntax is really quite simple. Since we already know how to write C#, it's basically like writing C#, and occasionally you just write HTML inside C#. Okay, now that we know reader syntax, let's come back to layout. The idea of layout is based on the observation that most views in a web application share some common elements. These common elements can be HTML elements like header, footer, sidebar, and so on. And they can also be code elements, like some views may import the same namespaces or have the same code at the beginning and so on. In Razor, common elements can be placed in three different places: underscore view imports dot cshtml, underscore view start dot cshtml, and a layout file. As we can tell from the name, underscore view imports is mainly for the import directives shared by the views. Take a look at this one, for example. This is the view imports file generated by the project template, and it includes the import directive for both the project namespace and the project.models namespace. In addition, it also adds all the built-in tag developers, so all the views can use those tag developers. Not tag developers, tag helpers. Again, we'll talk about tag helpers in the next video. We could have more than one view imports if we want. The rule is that each view import applies to the views in the same folder as well as views in its subfolders. For example, here, list.cshtml would take imports from both the ones in this view imports and the ones in this view imports. View start is where we can put common code shared by different views. And again, let's take a look at the one generated by the project template. And we can see that it has a statement that says layout is layout. And this is really what we see in view start. It says a layout file used by the views. If we mouse over layout, we can see that it's actually a property of this class called Razor Page Base. Razor Page Base is a superclass for all the Razor pages, and the layout property determines which layout file will be used for the page. This code, for example, basically says a layout file should be underscore layout, and remember view resolution, this name will resolve to the view file underscore layout dot C#HTML. So just like view imports, we could have multiple view start. For example, if you want the views in a certain folder to use a different layout file from the rest of the views, you can create another view start. For example, suppose we want all the views in the employees folder uses a different layout. All we need to do is just create another. Okay, because the project is running, it doesn't let me to add new view files. So what I'm trying to say is basically that we could have multiple view start. If we want all the views inside this folder to use a different layout, all we need to do is create another view start file, put it in here, and change the layout to another layout file. And in that case, all the views in this folder will use a different layout. And speaking of layout files, this is the one generated by the project template. As we can see, most of it is just HTML. The two important parts are render body and render section. Render section can be done synchronously or asynchronously, but the effects are the same. Here's the asynchronous version, and you can also use the synchronous version, which just says render section. Now, basically, render body will render the view in its place, and it's usually the main block in the page. Render section allows us to put additional block in the page. The first argument of render section is the name of the section, and the required parameter specifies whether the section is required or not. For example, here, required is false, meaning that a view does not need to specify this section. In fact, none of our views currently specify that section because that section is not required. A common usage of section is to have some additional JavaScript code on some views. For example, if we need to have this JavaScript code on a page, we can put this in the script sections. So, for example, right now, if we look at the generated HTML, we can see that right now it's linked to 3 JavaScript libraries: jQuery, Bootstrap, and Site. And that's because we have the 3 here. Now, suppose on this page, we want some additional JavaScript code, and we can say, put this inside the section called scripts, which is this section. And if we come back here, refresh, and if we look at here, we can see that now we have this additional JavaScript code, which is put into here using section. Razor also supports something called partial view. This is useful if we have some UI components that we want to reuse on several views. For example, suppose we created a nice form and we want to include this form on 2 different pages. We can put this form inside a partial view and then include it in other views, basically. To include a partial view, we can use a so-called tag helper, this partial tag, or something called HTML tag helper, like this one, HTML partial. HTML helper is the old way of doing things. If you look at older ASP.NET Core code, you'll see lots of examples using HTML helper. But for newer ASP.NET Core code, tag helper is the recommended way. In the next video, we'll talk more about tag helpers. Please check out Chapter 7 of the ASP.NET Core in Action book, and the Razor syntax documentation is also available online if you need to look up something. This is the end of this video. Thanks, and see you in the next one.